Good morning, everyone, everywhere and anywhere. Since you are here now, I welcome you along with Les and Anthony today. It's the 4th of July weekend, so we're going to have a few less people than we normally do, but I think it'll give us a chance to dig into the conversation a little deeper and broader with each of them. I want to mention to anyone listening that is struggling or suffering from what may seem out of control, and can certainly to the sufferer seem to be the only possibility that it's out of control and something they have nothing to do with and can't do anything about, that there are many programs and many options and many more people who can and will help. But your participation, your involvement is critical to any help they could potentially give you. It's very easy to feel alone and very easily to isolate and make believe because you're alone in your own isolation that all that's happening is what you think is happening. And I will assure you that everything that's actually happening is still happening no matter what you think. And that's largely what we're here to talk about. We are anonymous, and anonymity is a spiritual foundation, placing principles before personalities because it reveals a shared common nature in our existence. And it's something we do to allow people to listen without having any issues regarding any stigma they feel is attached to addiction or mental problems they're struggling with. But we also, as a group in discussion, maintain our anonymity so that we don't associate our experience to any one of the many problem or programs that we may be affiliated to for several reasons. One of them is that we don't want to use that program in our affiliation for any self-appointed personal purposes. We don't want to exploit our affiliation for any personal gain. We also don't want to sully the name of any of those organizations if, in fact, one of us was to go out and do something wrong publicly. So anonymity is a self-preservation for the organizations, but also a chance for us to have a safe environment to discuss what we discuss. And podcasts are a perfect environment for that, since the listener has the privacy of their own environment to rely on and choose. And we as an organization or group do not want to speak in terms of including other people's names or our affiliation to them, but we'll do our best to speak in terms of looking at a story or an experience we've had from a personal point of view that includes our own responsibility and what we have done in relation to that and what we've seen happen in that relationship that we have. And that's what our job is in this discussion. So for anyone in our discussion, we ask that you not use anyone's name or affiliation, father, mother, etc., just so that there's no potential harm done to them in their eyes, whether it's harm or not in your eyes. And also really zero in on what we can do to talk about our involvement responsibly and proactively. If you think there's no other way but to refer to someone, you can always just refer someone in my life, a person in my life, et cetera, which is easy enough and in general enough that I think it serves the point of anonymity so that we don't violate anyone else's space. So as far as the mental obsession goes, thinking is primary to our well-being. So how well we utilize thought determines our well-being. And we're not here to discuss how to get better about doing what's wrong or feel better about what's worse, but begin to see that feeling better includes conceding any wrongs we are perpetuating in thought. We're not here to fix what is broken, but begin to embrace what is wrong and held to be so dear. And most of the stories we tell are very much excuses being told to put the blame at the feet of others, other people, other places, and other things to excuse ourselves from doing what we've done and what we are doing. And we're going to continue to focus on what we're doing so that we can have a conversation about responsibility rather than reactiveness and defensiveness and continue to maintain the problem. We will not let go of what holds us, meaning if there's an essence to life, that's just part of what we are of, not something we make up by thinking about it. And we cannot and will not let go of things that we don't allow to be as they are. Our own denial of things as they are is what keeps us in a constant tug of war with those things. It isn't a wrong thing that condemns us. It's thinking that wrong thing is right that starts this interminable conflict inside of us. The reason addiction gets worse is because if the problem isn't being addressed at its core, which I'm going to suggest, not as a medical doctor or a scientist, that the core of addiction is mental. It says it in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I believed it as I started considering that. I started looking at my experience and saw that it was always the inner conflict I was struggling with that I was trying to overcome by treating the symptom of how I felt. When I felt bad, I thought I could feel better. So what I did was foster a relationship to drugs and alcohol that allowed me to continue to feel better about what I was doing that was worse. And that increasing need to drink more and do more drugs, which typically leads to overdosing, and I can attach to anything or anyone to try to distract myself and anchor myself in something other than what I'm doing. But by denying the problem grows. So what I need to do in a compulsive way is continue to do more and more and more of the same thing to try to stay ahead of the pain. So what we're doing here is not trying to do that any longer. We're trying to look at the actual core of the disease, talk about the core of the disease in the mental state, our chosen thoughts, and what the impact is on us. Wrong thought is always at the center of inner conflict and outer conflict. And it isn't the wrong thought, but thinking it's right, where the conflict begins. And self-righteousness is never right, since what is right never need be fought for, never need be a contest. It's right whether or not we think it's right or not. So all the contest we have is only ever about thought. And that's what our discussion is about. That's what our focus is about. We're not doctors. We're not scientists. We're not therapists. We're not coming at it from a religious standpoint or a philosophical standpoint. We're simply talking about experience, what we've learned, what we've seen, and what we do, in the hope, if there's any hope, that we can share something that may be beneficial and allow an opening to occur that may allow you to see things you may be doing that are causing the problems you think are happening to you, rather than start to recognize they're actually happening by you.
You said you don't mention philosophy at all. Is that true? You don't talk philosophy?
I suppose everything can be defined as philosophy, but I'm talking more about formal forms of philosophy, or even theology, dogma, any sort of conditioned, developed human ideas about.
And I love that intro, Jack, because it was so long I forgot what my problem was. Maybe that's sometimes a good way to get away from my problem if I just concentrate on something else for a couple of minutes.
Well, distraction is a form.
Oh, yeah, that's what I do.
But that's a form of what addiction is. It's the chance to think that because we cannot pay attention to what's happening, it's not happening. And it's a clear indication that we have a mental capacity to trick ourselves into thinking that simply because we're not paying attention to what's happening, that what's happening isn't happening.
Yeah. And I liked what you said too about being, sorry to cut you off, but I liked what you said about being alone and thinking if nobody else is around, those thoughts are true. I've never heard that before. I like that. I mean, that's really true. If I'm not talking to those other people, then I'm making the whole story up myself.
Well, when we're talking to ourselves, that's exactly what we're doing, because if you think of the self we're talking to, and I am talking to myself, there must be two of me to even be having a discussion. So I'm schizophrenic in my approach, wondering why I can't seem to get that discussion straight with the self I talk to, when in fact the self I'm talking to is wholly imagined, and I'm imagining it to be sufficient enough to actually talk back to me when it's my own talking that's actually that cycle is being both created and maintained by me making believe that something that's happening isn't actually even happening.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate distraction of denial. So enabling, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, enabling is the idea that you can make something possible for somebody.
Yeah.
And within addiction, since addiction is twisted, that means what we make possible is that people get worse. And how that's done is by treating symptoms. It's like having a rash on your arm and you get something to treat the rash, but it doesn't treat the actual problem. So the rash constantly comes back and constantly needs to be treated. That's one way of approaching addiction. And it's certainly a popular way of approaching addiction. And that is not what we're here talking about, except to be referring to it as one of the options that's available.
Right. We could either be talking about scratching all day or what the main cause of the problem is, I guess, all day.
Yes, sir.
I like that.
And how long have you and I been talking about that, Anthony?
2 years.
Yeah.
3 years.
So interesting that after 2 years, some of this would still seem new to you.
Yeah.
And the point to that is that wherever we are, always is new right now.
Yeah.
Right now, the present is always new.
Yeah.
Everything that's happening. Hang on, Matt is joining us. Everything. Good morning, Matt. Everything that is happening right now has never happened before. And yet what's happened before is that everything that's happening is always happening wherever we are, always. So the one constant is always reliable. And the other absolute nature of the present moment is that it's new. It's brand new. Means everything that's happening is happening for the first time it's ever happened. And the fact that it's been happening that way all this time, everything that's ever happened is the sum total of what we're experiencing right now. So everything that's ever happened is here now. It's not somewhere else. There is no other place. There is no other time. It's always happening here. It's always with us. And the question is, what do we make of it? What is it in our thinking that we do with this moment? And in a sense, Anthony, those new awarenesses are always possible if we're actually addressing what's happening accurately, because we're always looking at new eyes with everything, with new eyes at everything. And yet thinking and presuming how we've been thinking about it is what it's been, and as a result, all it can be, and wondering why we feel alone in the world, because the world that we're thinking of is limited to what we're thinking, rather than seeing that it's absolutely always present, always whole, always complete, always abundant, and always well beyond the limits of the thinking I do in relation to it, unless I'm simply expressing it rather than trying to conclude it and determine it and figure out what it is.
Does that make sense, Les?
It does, of course, but it seems to me like with so many ways of either looking at things or doing things, there's from what we're doing to what may become. When you were talking about it, Jack, one of the things that occurred to me is that when we think, like if we're alone or our thought that that's all there is, one of the things that I learned, or one of the processes of meditation, is in order to expand my understanding and awareness, in order to not believe that all I think is all there is one tries to separate themselves and be objective or a witness, looking at both myself and my surroundings or the circumstances, to hopefully give me a perspective and allow me to see what I'm doing or recognize what I'm doing. And I'm not sure if that's exactly like looking into the mirror as into what you presented to us, but I did find that for me as a process to get to the point where you say we can or should be in our thinking or understanding, that was helpful to demonstrate not only my limitation or my obsession or my self-centered desire to enhance, exacerbate, or expound upon either what made me feel good or feel bad, to justify those thoughts and feelings. And it helped me to separate and become more connected as compared to separate.
Well, and what's interesting, Les, is that feelings tend to follow thoughts. And I would say simultaneously, because our feelings and our thinking, my experience is that they're intimately connected. And our senses aren't giving us opinions. They're just giving us data about our environment, accurate, raw data that doesn't have an opinion. And what we think about that data is how we feel. So if I'm thinking the data I'm getting has me separate from the world, the chances are I'm going to feel afraid because all of a sudden I'm alone. And so what you just described was an awareness that transcended the bounds of the limited thinking. And I would suggest that obsessive thinking always has us thinking the bounds of the limits it's thinking of is everything that there is, which would cause anxiety and stress naturally if there was more than what we were thinking. Because what we were thinking, in terms of the limits of the ideas that we were chronically thinking about, wouldn't be all that there is. And so if we knew better, if we were an observer of a greater sense of awareness, we would know better than to think the thinking was real and true, and we would feel afraid naturally. So the anxiety that's created is actually a consequence. Like you said, you feel better being the observer and starting to recognize that. You've always been the observer. You've always had a knowing, awakened awareness that is the essence of your existence. You can't be apart from something that's essential to existence. And yet, starting to concede that to thought allows the thought to be seen in proper proportion to what it is as something we do, that humans do, that brains do, something we do, rather than think of it as something we are.
Well, for me, I've often used the analogy or the description since I've heard anywhere from 6,000 to 17,000 thoughts a day. None or most of those are either true or real or whatever. That for me to give a lot of credence, particularly when, like you say, thoughts or whatever can create anxiety, stress, depression, and the like. The visualization of me, instead of being a participant in the thoughts, an actor in the movie, that I was actually sitting in the theater and watching the thoughts go by and just taking them in for the information as compared to the feeling. It allowed me then to differentiate or at least see initially that my thoughts are not reality. They're not everything. And second of all, when by being objective, I could determine what either was or wasn't healthy in my course of thinking, or if there was something that was disturbing me in my thinking. By being objective, it allowed me to look at it and go, ooh, why, how, or can I do something about it? And it might be just as sufficient as Anthony said to, distract or ignore it.
Yeah.
That's all that does. That's a temporary relief.
Yeah.
To me, the concept of ignoring something or distracting from the thought is almost the same as taking the drink to get over the thought of drinking.
It is exactly the same. Exactly. And the irony of the temporary relief is that it isn't relief at all, because the problem's getting worse because we think we're treating it. And as a result, we think it's getting better because we're feeling better. But what we're getting better at feeling is that we're doing something worse because it's still growing and it's still more wrong because it's growing.
Oh, yeah.
You follow that? It's delusion that we think we're getting better. The same way we think we're getting better by drinking and using drugs because it gives us a temporary feeling. But in fact, the problem is still brewing. It's still on full boil, and it's going to brew. And like a steam pot, if you continue to boil it, it's going to explode. And nervous breakdowns and reactiveness are examples of that explosion of thoughts being simmered and coming to a boil when anybody gets too near us and all of a sudden gets to that point where we feel those things are at risk because we feel defensively like the further we keep people from us, the safer we are, which is kind of interesting that we're intimately bound and think we're better off being further away from people rather than see that the thing we're protecting is the thing that we're doing that's delusional. It's defensive. It's defiance. It's denial.
The concept of ignoring, or as you said, denial of the problem. The term I heard was, analogy I heard as when I was young, was putting a brick on top of a pressure cooker. And that somehow you have to let out the steam occasionally, or else. I recall there was a early, I should say early, but 50 years ago, a self-help book called "You Are Not the Target," and what it said was, the concept was that we often take, feel, or absorb not only what we're thinking, but whatever our most recent interaction or disturbance was. And so if somebody came at me and I felt either hurt, oppressed, defensive, angry, it's likely that the next person I spoke to would get that same thought or energy because I was reacting to what had happened before me. And when it comes to these things like, ignoring a problem, compounding it, perpetuating it, or in the case of addictions, to actually continue to do them, thinking ultimately things will become different. All I'm doing is mounting that pressure so that instead of having the relief may come from why do people do either suicide or overdosing or whatever? It just, there's no release unless one is willing to, willingness, I guess, is the key to any change.
Well, change is always happening, whether we're willing or not, when it comes to things. But the kind of change that can be affected is very different when you begin to realize that your own reactiveness creates an interreactiveness between other people. And when I'm reactive, I feed and fuel the grid of fear that helps people justify what they're afraid of is real and true. When it's all coming out of imagination, it's all coming out of self-induced, self-imposed, self-propelled ideas about what truth and reality are about, when in fact they have nothing to do with truth and reality and everything to do with my own thoughts, limited thoughts and conclusions that I use for the convenience of making believe I'm in control, which is why I act out of control, which is what addiction effectively is. So to your point of observing less,
sure.
to your point of observing the thoughts, one of the images I got when I started seeing this was that if you go to see a parade and you just stand on the corner, you get to see the whole parade as it passes by. But if you get in the parade, you may have a more intimate relationship to the portion of the parade you're in, but you miss the parade. The perspective disappears. And mentally obsessive thoughts is exactly that. When I start thinking about the thinking I'm doing is all that's happening, I start thinking all that's happening is what I'm thinking. And as a result, that becomes what I think is reality. And as a result, it becomes who I think I am. And now I am just a point trying to be made with no perspective, because perspective always involves more than a point. It may be a focal point in the distance, but the perspective getting there always starts with a broader view. And it narrows in the distance. It may narrow in the distance, but it comes from a broader view, which is what we're talking about when you just suggested watching the thoughts is a chance. If we can even watch them, they can't be who we are if there's something we're doing. I am not an arm flailing in the air because I choose to have my arm flapping in the wind.
Few and of if us you watch it long enough, it's not even a parade you realize you're in.
Well, exactly. You're actually you're in a parade of successive thoughts that you're relying on as hope to eventually get to the end, and yet the chronic nature of this thinking is a cycle, so it turns and turns and turns, and like a cannibal feeds on the thoughts it's producing, and even cannibals historically have not been known to eat themselves, and yet this sort of thinking does exactly that. So the induced fear is an accurate assessment of the body saying something is wrong here. And pain is often mistaken for reality, saying, well, if it hurts, it must be true. But really what pain is a recognition of the body saying something is wrong. Attention need be paid here. And the distraction, Anthony, is taking my attention away from that wrong, thinking because I'm not paying attention to it, it gets better. Your word was ignore less, and ignoring things is what ignorance is.
Yeah.
It's a dumbing down, an attempt to become numb to what's happening rather than, as sentient beings, be sensitive to what's happening and begin to concede what's happening as it's happening and start to notice that our intellect and awareness is based, our human intellect and awareness is based on our ability to feel things sensitively, not to avoid them, not to feel overwhelmed by them, because we create these scenarios where we justify not feeling as a solution and end up becoming numb to what's happening and wonder why we feel this low-grade sense of fear all the time, because we're not actually paying attention to what's actually happening. And we know better than to think that's actually all that's happening. We wouldn't fear these automatic consequences we seem to suffer from wouldn't occur as clearly as they do if we weren't aware of something greater than what we're thinking. So when we feel wrong and bad and anxious and afraid, I guarantee you there is something wrong, bad, and anxious to be afraid of. And that those sensations we're getting back, that feedback we're getting, we mistake when we think of them as things to get away from, rather than as signposts saying, look, you're doing 90 miles an hour, there's a 20-mile-an-hour turn, and no sign ever got off its post and ran into my windshield and said, listen to me. But if I actually respected the signs, I probably kept myself from going over the cliff multiple times. And body language is designed to give us that direction. And we don't listen very well when we're making believe the job we have is to overcome it and get away from it and not feel it and think that all we need to do is oppose it rather than begin to concede. This is good information if I'm looking at it honestly, rather than looking at it in the addictive nature of thinking outrunning it or I can escape it while I'm taking it with me everywhere I go.
And can you touch a little more on enabling? You were talking about what it's like to enable, whether you're giving somebody advice or how that works, enabling somebody if it's bad.
Well, if you take the example that I just used about the way we treat ourselves, thinking that the thing to do with the feelings we have is to get away from them and escape them, and thinking more positive would be a good example of that. I'm not opposed to any of the things I talk about people doing. I'm not here to say don't think positively. I'm here to suggest if we're constantly thinking that we need to feel better and we want to feel good and we need to think more positive thoughts, isn't it because we're feeling bad and worse and thinking negative thoughts that we're trying to overcome those things by doing the opposite? Aren't we conceding the fact and the simple instigation that we have to do those things, that we're actually doing the things we're claiming we need to overcome? And if I'm doing that, I am treating, as we just talked about, I'm treating the symptom, and enabling is effectively the idea that my help of someone else is helping them when in fact I'm hurting them. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Nick.
Good afternoon here.
Oh, good afternoon,
Good
Nick.
afternoon, Nick.
You mentioned that thinking positive thoughts, and I took it one of two ways. Maybe both are accurate. First of all, the concept of, hey, think positive thoughts already acknowledges or makes one believe that thinking is all there is, and I control that. And as a result, if I do that, everything is better. It doesn't, it may actually deny the existence of something more than thinking that makes me think or feel negative.
The only reason we have those negative thoughts, Les, it's exactly on the point. The fact that we can become consumed with a wrong thought and think that it's right, and then constantly run around that hamster wheel of thinking that if I run faster or slower or a little bit in this direction, a little bit in that direction, that somehow it's going to get better, all manages the problem.
Or it's the wheel's fault.
Or if the problem is self-induced in thought,
it's hamster wheel's fault.
Something I'm thinking about, and I continue to manage it.
Yeah.
There isn't anything to even manage that has.
If I just had a better hamster wheel, is what you're saying, all these problems would go away.
But that's the cyclical thinking, cyclical be all end all, that the solution to thought is thought.
Yes.
I'm starting from the premise that Jack is trying to hopefully help us with this obsession, that it is one of many, I'll call it things, connectivity aspects of the overall experience of the universe and life. And that and you said, Jack, that feelings often are reactions or come from as a result of thoughts, that when I'm having a disturbing or negative thought, we've talked about a couple things that happen. The first one, the most easy one and the least effective, is distraction or ignorance. The second one to say is to immediately take the thought as being wrong and say, I'm going to turn it positive. Again, leaving myself only in the hamster wheel of how to run maybe differently or from one side or the other or a different pace within the hamster wheel, as compared to trying to look at why am I thinking this way.
I'll make it even simpler. The why will always look for an excuse in places that you're not. So it will look to the past. It'll look at things done. It'll look at things you have. It'll look in everywhere else but where you are. And you know what? It's useless. The issue is what? What am I doing? And if you just defined it, Les, if what I think is wrong and I think it's right, what is that? Certainly it's a conflict, right?
Yes.
And that's the inner conflict right there. What would it also be if I think wrong is right? It would be a lie. Can't be true. And if truth is true, and truth is the basis of existence and reality, there is no lie other than in my own thinking. That's it. So there are no lies other than what we think. Thinking is uniquely qualified. Human thinking is uniquely qualified to think of itself, and as a result, it thinks of itself born in thought and becomes who we think we are. And it isn't true. Ego is a fiction of imagination. There is no ego that can attack us. There is no ego that acts for or against us. There is no ego that has any basis whatsoever other than in thought. It doesn't mean we can't think there is, and it doesn't mean as a result we can't think in conflicted ways that lead to conflicted actions that cause others the same conflict, so we can claim, see, I knew it was the world that was wrong. I knew that I would get that result, because we are manifestors of what we choose to create.
And is being wrong different from a lie? Like, you can be wrong is one thing in a lie, because animals don't lie to themselves. A deer doesn't lie, but it is wrong a lot. It thinks one thing and it's wrong.
So what you're defining, Anthony, is that it isn't wrong to be wrong. Actually, when wrong is wrong, it's right.
Right.
So this is part of the point we're heading toward. If wrong is wrong, it's right. It's a perfect acknowledgement and concession that maybe it isn't the best thing for us to do. maybe it's an indication of our greater knowing self saying, eating more poison here this thing is bitter. It tastes like shit. My body is breaking down. Maybe eating more of it isn't the best thing to do. And imagine when humans started exploring the world and got hungry, there were probably a lot of options that they didn't understand what was better or worse, but the consequence of eating those things would tell them quickly whether it was something to continue doing or not. When we think what we're thinking is so true and right that we need to fight for it, I will guarantee you it isn't true or right. It's simply being fought for within the confines of a limited idea that isn't true, but one we've chosen and one we might prefer and one we might like. But it's interesting how liking something like that has us not like so many other things as a result of that. And again, it shows how the conflict immediately begins to reveal itself in our midst. And if we're reading the signs at all, if we're reading the body language at all, if we're reading the circumstances we're manifesting at all, we'll start seeing the conflicts that are created by the choices and the actions we take as signposts and guides to help us either continue or stop. Either be honest about what's happening or continue to make believe we're going to continue to do it and somehow, someday it'll be right when it never seems to be.
And mental obsession, just thinking about, like, I'm thinking, what problems could I apply this to? Like food. So if I'm thinking I'm eating too much food, the mental obsession is not really strictly looking at just I'm eating too much food and this is the weight. It's more like I'm a terrible person. I'm never going to change. The mental obsession is much deeper than I'm eating too much food.
Let's use those two examples, Anthony. You're a terrible person and you're never going to change. Isn't it interesting that a succession of thoughts that we induce and create that clearly aren't who we are all of a sudden start telling us exactly about themselves in terms that would be accurate? I'm terrible. What was the other one you used? I'm never going to be good enough.
I'm never going to change.
I'm never going to change. Okay. So isn't that interesting that thoughts that are chronic, that chronically repeat themselves, all of a sudden start complaining about not changing? You see that?
Yeah, that's funny. Wait, let me think. So
it isn't funny. It's actually a sad contradiction that we will use those things to continue doing the thing in the exact same way, thinking that by redoing the thing without changing what we're doing isn't a problem, when in fact we're bemoaning the problem of not wanting to ever change.
So say it again. Say the part about not wanting to change, because
so you said you were terrible and would never change.
Yeah.
As a condition of food.
Right.
Let me tell you, the list of compulsions is endless that we can attach to
shopping,
to distract ourselves. Everything, every combination of relationship we're in can be chosen to attach to as an anchor to escape what we think we're able to escape, and because we're unwilling to concede what we're actually doing. It happens all day long. It's not limited to the most egregious, obvious things, but it includes all of them, because we're now talking about the actual dis-ease, the lack of ease that we create when we create instability in our thinking, and we create inner conflict in our thinking, and we create emotional turmoil as a result of the thinking we're doing. So you're terrible and won't change.
Yeah. Other than that, I'm fine.
So let's say you're terrible. Maybe terrible is a good definition of the thought you're having, which is terrible, right?
Yeah.
And what do we take it as? Who I am is terrible.
Right.
Why? Because I think I've become that thought.
And
I think I've become that thought.
And it's in your own voice.
Yes. You're creating, maintaining, manifesting, and not seeing it as something you're doing, which ironically, if we look at what we're doing wrong and start looking at what humans have done as wrong, it becomes pretty apparent that we can be great manifestors. We are great manifestors, but we've just manifested a lot of things that are wrong. Pollution and corruption and poison and toxins and radioactivity and all that stuff. We've been responsible for a great deal of that we would rather not talk about as being our doing, because it would actually confront the exact same issue that each of us bear the responsibility for.
Okay, so let's go work it through that. So I'm gaining too much weight. I'm still eating too much. And I say to myself, I'm terrible. I'm never going to change. Where does this get me? How do I get out of that loop?
Well, I start noticing that you're accurately assessing. You can either see those two things as conditions of who you are, which is really you're conceding that they're conditions of who you think you are. So who you think you are can't be who you are, right? If thinking is something you do, that's like saying you're an arm flying in the wind when you decide to try to flap your arm.
Yeah.
That's something you're doing. It isn't who you are. So that transition has us make believe it's who we are, because we have made believe that thinking is all we are, as Les pointed out. When I start thinking about my thinking, I start thinking all I am is what I think. And all of a sudden, the source of my existence becomes thought. But let me ask you, didn't things exist before you and I started thinking?
Yeah.
There seems to be some evidence.
I have something to say on that.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so I don't remember which German philosopher it was, but the philosopher said that, yes, things existed before us, but it's the human mind that gave it a name and a definition and
Yeah.
a purpose beyond its original purpose.
Well,
So
I don't think
don't we
it's,
have to? Sorry.
I don't think it's beyond its original purpose if it's still serving the purpose that is beyond our language and words and the attachments we've given to it.
So the example he used was like, is a tool if it's not in your hands?
Well, I would ask if it couldn't ever be in your hands, maybe not, but if it could, certainly it might be. So, you can't dismiss potential and possibility for the fact that you're not using it now and then claim there's no hope in the world because you simply haven't decided to pick up the tool.
And the mental obsession, just going into the mental obsession real quick. I saw this guy and he was in great shape. I mean, he could tell he worked out a lot. I said, man, you look like you're in great shape. And he said, yeah, I work out 6 hours a day. 6 days a week, all day long. It's just great. Once you do it for 45 days, you're like a new person and this and that. And I said goodbye to him, and as I forgot something, so I walked back. He was smoking a cigarette. I go, wait a second, what's going on? You're smoking a cigarette? He goes, one thing at a time. So the mental obsession is like, if I would have just kept walking, I would have had one thought in my head thinking about how terrible I am and I can't do it. But then I walk back and I see something else.
Part of the obsession also, Anthony, is needing to use other people to get perspective on what we're doing.
I don't do that.
Well, listen, we have spoken before about the difference between fuck you and thank you. And when you begin seeing that what's terrible and not changing is what you're doing in thought, not who you are, you begin seeing that what people do to trigger those reactions in you are a gift they're giving you of perspective rather than something you can thank them for rather than say fuck you to them for getting close. Uh-huh. And the difference is one is basically representing the fear that's built up in the tension and stress we create, thinking we're hiding this thing we're doing. And the other is the thankfulness for beginning to have the perspective of saying, oh, I really have a lot of buildup in that area, and start to address what you're actually doing rather than reacting to it as something to hide and cover up. There are no secrets in this universe. Everything we do has an impact on how we express ourselves, how we interact with all other things, and what our body does as a result. And if I'm busy undermining my mental state, my body is suffering a level of stress and anxiety that undermines all of my bodily systems. So I become susceptible to diseases, which are another manifestation of the dis-ease of my thinking. It's not an accident. It's not a curse. It's a consequence. And the only time I hate the consequences I get is when I'm unwilling to be responsible for the actions I took to get them there. That's it. So I use the consequences as a problem rather than what I did to have them happen. I'm always at the center of that. If we are responsible by nature and there is any responsibility in truth and reality for all that we're experiencing to even exist, then clearly we are responsible in nature, not as a choice, but as a condition, as a state of being. And when I concede that, I stop debating all of the issues with all of the people and all of the things. And I can't say that I've done that yet, because I still have plenty of debates. But as I begin conceding that, I start seeing those debates just as Les described, where the thoughts all of a sudden just became thoughts. They started being seen for what they were, just thoughts. It's a lot easier to have thoughts that are thoughts than think thoughts are reality and truth and wonder how you can continue to maintain the charade that they're in a parade marching for life when it's actually a death march. Very different experience. So when I see what I'm doing, I can say, oh, I'm doing that. Yeah, I get it. I'm up to something in me, whatever it is. I don't have to even know what it is. I'm not looking to answer why. I'm only looking at that. This is happening. It's happening. If I'm involved, I'm creating it. For whatever reason is irrelevant. Since I can't possibly get the culmination of all the reasons perfectly thought of in new words, just like Nick just pointed out about the language we use. Because all of those reasons are the sum total of my present experience expressing themselves in that reactive thought. I don't need any more than that. I'm already there. I'm already with everything that ever is right now, always. And to see it that way is to begin to be relieved of thinking there's anything I need to do about it, but have it for what it is, whatever it is.
So what you're saying is that if you tell a lie and then you tell another lie, then it becomes true.
I would hang up for the day. I don't know how that
two lies you were saying two lies become the truth, right? So if you tell one lie, you got to tell another lie, and then it becomes the truth.
I don't think that came anywhere near my mouth.
Two wrongs make a right. That's what you said. Okay.
No, if wrong is wrong, it's right to have it wrong. I'm not saying that it makes it right. I'm saying the acknowledge of it is an acceptance of the wrong it is. And if it's wrong, it's never going to be right. You can utilize it. The difference between right and wrong is that right is utilitarian. It has a usefulness.
Yeah.
It can be applied. It can be used in beneficial, constructive, productive means. Yes. Wrong is never useful. It's never going to be helpful. It's never going to
I disagree. There's sometimes when wrong has got to be good. Can't always be bad. Nothing's always.
That may explain why you're still here
bad.
2 years later.
What about like a white lie?
You know, it's funny that we've renamed all kinds of things that you don't hear people say, well, it was a white murder. You know,
that's because in the dictionary, white has the definition of being associated with purity and innocence.
Exactly. So think of that. Think of the claim that we would use language, to your point earlier about humans using language. Clearly, language is just an attempt. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that words are the skin of ideas. They're just wrapping ideas. But the wrapping isn't the idea, it's the wrapping. It's the outward appearance. It's the way we talk about things and the way we're capable of communicating things in writing. Words don't explain the thing. Words reference the thing, point to the thing. Think about unconditional love. Love is unconditional by nature. Who needs to repeat that it's unconditional? It's like saying wet water to help people understand that if they dive in, they might get wet.
That's because you look at it as a complete absolute, and it may well be. Yes. But what Nick was saying as far as a white lie, there is a process by which one may say or not say something because they believe that their version of acknowledging or expressing what they think to be the truth to someone else might actually be more harmful than either not saying something or
that's the enabling part. That's enabling again.
They're right. It is more harmful, but not in the way they're seeing it because they're using it as an excuse to continue perpetuating the harm. The harm comes,
or they could be wrong to begin with because they're doing a white lie because maybe their perception or their thoughts about what the other person is or isn't doing or happening or not happening is completely.
Why would
limited.
They be whitewashing it if they didn't think it was dark?
We talk
about
different
this
levels of sensitivity too.
Well, let's just talk about
because I want to look good and not hurt someone's feelings.
Do you have? Well, if feelings are hurt, they're going to be hurt when they are approached. Period. It isn't because I hurt them that they hurt. People are nursing hurt feelings, thinking they're not hurt because people don't approach them, and they think they're safe in the world because they've created numbness to what's happening. That's actually a greater threat to them. If you're numb to what's happening, you could have your leg cut off and not notice it, and rather than take care of it, die as a result of it. Numbness is not a goal for a living, thriving species. But that's how we do it.
That's how
we numb ourselves. We become calloused to what's happening in the name of making believe that we can control these things by calling things white. Nobody calls it dark lies because they're naturally dark.
Black lies.
They're not even observational because they don't have any substance.
I saw a motivational speaker before this call that said, feelings keep you in bed in the morning, not getting out of bed. Your thoughts get you out of bed. Your brain knows to get up. Your feelings want to keep you there in bed.
Well, That's an acknowledgement that he thinks his feelings have a life of their own. Think about that. Have you ever had a feeling when you didn't have a body? Do you ever remember feeling anything that wasn't happening to you?
Yeah, in a way, a feeling is kind of a thought, because that's
Of course
a thought.
it is.
Yeah.
Think of the way people express their thoughts, their feelings. They're always in thoughts. Bad, worse, upset, angry, lonely, sad. Those are all words that come from thought.
Uh-huh.
They're simultaneous. They're not something separate. Our senses are constantly providing. We have many more senses than the ones that are obvious to us. We have awarenesses that go well beyond the senses the 5 senses that we talk about.
Yeah.
Including the 6th sense, and I think they're up to 11 or 12. Physicists are up to 11 or 12 different senses that we have that are quantifiable by whatever means that means.
So when I have that thought, it's like, well, you're never going to change. You're terrible.
You're
So it's like,
committing
well,
to the thought, Anthony.
Yeah. So
You're
I should say,
committing
no, I could change.
to the insanity of the thought and maintaining it and saying, yeah, that's right. I just give up.
I don't have to eat that the next time. Next time I can say no to that.
Now think about eating more. It's a form of insulation.
Uh-huh.
You just grow and grow and grow, trying to get more and more distant to what's happening when in
I
fact
could
you're immediately affected by it.
Or I remind myself, hey, that's not the last time you're going to eat. You're going to be eating a lot more times. We still have a chance to win this game.
So that's a management style.
Yeah. Is that good?
I don't know, good or bad, but it helps maintain the problem because you're trying to feel better about it. I'm not suggesting these aren't things we can't do.
What's the other side? What's the other side? You're right. You are eating too much. You're terrible. No change.
No, it's noticing that the thought's terrible. It's not you. You are assigning that thought to who you are rather than seeing it's simply a thought you're having. And the terrible isn't the thought you're having. It's the thought that it's real and true, which is exactly what turns what is wrong into a lie, is when we think what's wrong is right and we think we're right and true and real as a result. That's exactly the transition between just having something as it is and turning it into this seeming monster that seems to consume us and become.
I think you have to live life. You have to have some type of management style, right? If you don't have a management style, it's going to be pretty tough to live life, right?
Well, I would say that helps explain a lot of your behaviors.
Don't you have a management style?
Whether I do or not doesn't treat your point and problem.
But I think everybody has to have one. A manager, everybody. There's that everybody.
So given that most of your problems are thinking for yourself, Anthony, and now you're thinking for everyone else, isn't it interesting how sure you can be about what everyone else is doing? Isn't it interesting how sure you can be about everyone else while in fact living in self-doubt?
Yeah, that's what somebody I heard talking about, where you need somebody else to see behind you. You can't really see.
We're talking about it right now. You don't need anybody else right now.
Yeah, sometimes there's blind spots you have.
Well, I would say any denial is a blind spot. Anything focused on as being true that isn't is a blind spot.
Yeah.
There's nothing there, so it can't actually amount to anything other than we continually talk about it.
One of the things I don't like is my management style. Actually, it's funny that I was just thinking.
Well, see, I'm not sure that you have a management style. What I find interesting about you, Anthony, is your willingness to speak whatever comes to your mind, knowing the limitations or inaccuracies of thought, and yet you do it and you find humor in it. It's almost like, to be honest, because I know that you're doing this, you could have plenty of people to talk to that could conflate your ego or whatever. I do believe that you're honestly trying to understand and to be part of and develop and grow in both connectivity and maturity. But I often think of the line tears of a clown, the way that you describe yourself here. And they're self-deprecating instead of, I think there's other ways that you could provide insight, help, and understanding to us and others than the way you do things.
Like what?
And I say that because because unless someone is willing, like Jack or others, to listen to it, your constant teasing of either what's going on about yourself or whatever eventually becomes quite tiresome.
Well, and we
Particularly in
focused on
light
that.
of, for example, if this were a class or a seminar where people are trying to learn and expand and expound, to see you repetitively say the things that you say year in, year out, they might not find that humorous, or they might not find that they're getting the development or the capacity. Maybe I'll put it this way: I get it. And I'm willing, and when I'm not getting it, and when I'm disturbed by what you do, I recognize I'm seeing myself in doing some of that self-deprecation or whatever, in order to make light of my discomfort. But I would also be disingenuous if I didn't bring it up to you that I can't believe that this is the sum total extent of your understanding and capacity after all the time we've spent together.
Well, and Anthony, as we've talked before, my suspicion is, and I don't need to be right about this, but I have dealt with enough people that it's a pretty easy read, is that it's pain that's been dealt with in a management style that you just conceded for the first time is really a mismanagement style. And
I don't like my management style sometimes.
Addiction always.
Fire your manager.
Fire that manager.
Since addiction is a lie, and a lie is based on a contention that it's true, a lie is only trying to be what it's not. So the idea that you're managing this is trying to call it management as though it's something you can do that's good, when in fact it's mismanagement and helping to promote what
and now
you're
we're
doing.
20 minutes and it just got real, guys.
No, it's been real the whole time. Reality doesn't change and disappear because you and I don't talk about it accurately or honestly.
That's funny. Okay, well, how do you manage it?
I also find it interesting, Anthony, that you laugh at this.
Well, because
most people, because it's what? I want to hear this.
I don't know. I'm trying to think, because it feels good to talk about it. It's funny. I feel relieved.
That's interesting that instead of trying to deflect or, not think that what Jack may be trying to espouse helps to you with your obsession, you laugh at it, and therefore what my perception was of that laugh is that you were in denial, but you acknowledge it as actually being helpful. So interesting.
Yeah,
like I say, I do find you very interesting, and I also want you to know that I appreciate you, and I express the dichotomy that of the way you talk and act like this. And yet I've seen your actions over the course of our time to be so connected and loving that
part of the management style I would be honest, I would like to have more management style like Les. There's a lot of qualities I like. Les seems very good at managing.
I think he would like you to have more of his management style too.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn from Les.
Listen, we all have failings. Society wouldn't be doing what society is doing today if we weren't all participating in it, in a very orchestrated conspiracy to make believe that we have nothing to do with it, and somehow it will get better if we just pay more attention to what we're doing and not actually get accurate about the fact that we're absolutely involved, that we are participants, that we're witnessing things that are horrifying and acting as though because they haven't happened to our neighbors that they're not happening. And I would say that's pretty good example of this collective philosophy that we've been maintaining, or this convention culture that somehow, if it's not happening to us immediately, it's not happening. It's just a broader sense of denial.
And it's the closest I can get to touching it, because I know it's there, but I don't usually let anybody touch it. Like we're kind of like.
Anthony, you're a perfect example of someone who absolutely knows it's there. You are.
And I don't even know what we're talking about. Actually,
from the first time we met, you responded, you had some awareness.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that our human capacity is immediately recovered when human history has been repeating this for thousands of years, and cultures and nations have been built on this.
What are we talking about? Wait, stop. I'm not trying to be funny or anything, but what exactly, when you say this, what are you exactly
This obsessive thinking that denial is in fact a winning formula, and saying things that are lies are somehow going to help people get better,
Yeah.
and not being honest with one another is a winning formula for survival. It isn't. It's actually showing us that survival has been put at risk. And rather than thrive and survive, we're actually beginning to face some things that are pretty obviously wrong while making believe they're barely happening. For the most part, collectively, we're not looking at it as honestly as I know we could, given the frankness of circumstance and nature. Nature isn't fooling us. Nature isn't all of a sudden saying, oh, well, you guys have ignored me long enough. Now I'm going to really screw with you. It's basically reflecting what it is we've done to any degree that it's doing whatever it's doing as a result of what we've done. And it's probably worth noting, probably at least worth bringing up in a conversation and suggesting that maybe we have something to do with it, and to see if we have been able to delude ourselves collectively after all this time and think that's normal.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take long to speak in normal terms to help people see that the absolute state of our awareness is fully intact. It isn't missing because we think it is. It isn't missing because we lie about it. It isn't missing at all. It's
I don't like talking
absolutely.
about collectively so much. Collectively sounds just too broad. I like talking about me more, or you.
I know that, but I assure you, I assure you, Anthony, that your life in terms of your human experience is also dependent on everything and everyone else.
Yeah.
And none of us live exclusive of the oxygen we all share, the planet that we're all on, or the resources that come from that to feed us. None of us are exclusive to that. We may carve out little seeming lives that are separate, but that's part of the problem, is that we think of them as actually separate when in fact they're absolutely part of the same thing that we're all sharing. And by thinking of them as separate gives us this seeming license to think of them in ways that are good for us and not good for others, but think because we don't think about what's wrong with others and what's bad about what's going on that we're doing, that somehow others aren't affected by it. And that's just another lie. So,
and the mental obsession is kind of trying to fill in too many pieces almost, I feel like instead of just taking it for what it is.
Nothing empty about fullness already. One of the big concessions here is seeing it doesn't take our thinking about
wrong thoughts,
what's right or real or true, to make what's right, real, and true.
Yeah.
It just is what it is. It already is there. The problem is we are preoccupied with thinking what our interpretation of it is.
Yeah.
What we think about it is all that it is, and wonder why we have inner turmoil and conflict and think that it's just a normal part of life, while it is in fact an abnormal reaction to knowing better.
Yeah.
We wouldn't suffer.
I disagree with Anthony's statement that, it's too much to talk about or think about. That already gives an inflated value and place of the thinking.
Well, it also, the other thing that's interesting is that we think of grandiosity as being huge, but grandiosity isn't huge. It's an overstatement of the facts. And if the fact is that we're all intimately combined and we're all interacting right now with everything that's happening everywhere that it's happening, and we're a part of that, that isn't an overstatement. That's a simple fact. That's an actual statement, a factual statement. It just is how it is. It isn't up to us. For us to think it's less than that is grandiose. For us to think that it's only us is arrogant. For us to think in terms that separate and deny the totality and that cumulative combination of all things being all things that are happening right now is an attempt to make believe that our thinking is the reigning superior, supreme source, when in fact the source is the source, and our thinking is something that source has allowed within the confines or limits that we seem to be existing in. Whatever they are, and they may not.
So wait, are you saying
they may not be limited at all, Anthony? By the way,
so you're saying that parade's going to be there either way? I don't have to be there watching it for that parade to go on. It's going on with or without me.
Yes, exactly.
I like that. I don't have to be there watching the parade for it to happen.
part of
Anthony, I thought you were the parade.
I just want to be the owner of the parade. I want the buildings around the parade that the street's going down.
So this doesn't prevent us from doing any of the things we want to do. It actually gives us a chance to begin doing those things with a greater sense of no need for confidence, because we're starting to think in ways that are possible rather than think about things in impossible ways and think we need to overcome what appears to be impossible with great confidence and ambition and drive, rather than simply see that it's a natural consequence of any productive behavior.
Yeah, and I just flew on an airplane the other day, and you look at those engines and the size of that plane and the weight of those wings, and you'd swear that thing's never going to, even though you've been in that plane, you've seen it fly. It's just, to me, it's amazing every time it gets off the ground. It's just unimaginable.
Well, one of the things interesting about aviation is it's one of the only industries in the world where everyone who flies planes shares data when something goes wrong.
Yeah, all over the world.
When there's a crash, people send people there to investigate, and all national borders are open because flying doesn't leave a lot of room for error.
Yeah. And they talk about, there was a comedian that was mentioning that you just you get on a plane, you don't know this pilot or anything, you just trust that this guy is going to fly this thing and get you where you're going to go. You never even see him, which is just crazy.
Up until the last, I don't know, when the kamikaze started, I think there was a presumption that the self-interest of the pilot would be to survive the flight rather than condemn the passengers to his own fate. And that now has happened multiple times where pilots have just decided to fly the plane into a building or the ocean for their own sake, for their own purpose. I would say that probably isn't the best thinking that led to that. And it's the exact kind of thinking that leads to suicide, homicide, and addiction. Addiction is suicide. It is homicide. The only difference with homicide is who you choose to kill. Suicide is, in fact, a form of homicide. Good morning, Jackie.
And just for recording purposes, I am losing weight.
Good morning. I'm traveling, so I'm I'm in LA, but I'm on the go. I'm in between taking detoxers for a run.
Where are you running?
All over the place. I go to rehabs and take people that are detoxing for a run or walk.
Oh, I see. Wow, nice. So they can sweat it out a little bit and get their feet moving.
Has anyone been able to run farther than you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. For sure. I remember I used to run really well when I was hungover. I could run better when I was hungover than sober. I don't know why. And tennis. I played better tennis when I was drinking. Anyway, I'm going to mute myself. You're on fire, Anthony.
I need you to put me out.
I hope not.
No, this is getting to the core issues. I hate my management style. I need a new manager. Where do you just go get a new one, though?
Anthony, part of the issue, part of the problem is thinking somehow that it's all up to us. We're alone. It's what I do that makes all the difference. What's interesting is what I do makes a huge difference. But if what I'm doing chronically in addictive thinking is constantly subjecting me to consequences and problems that I claim not to want, that's a pretty sick manifestation that I'm creating while I'm ignoring the fact that it's me creating it. So if I'm looking for a new management style, just like we talked months ago about the teeter-totter, if I'm trying to constantly balance what's out of balance, what we're here to look at is the lack of balance that we constantly try to bring balance to. If we're unstable, why not notice that a teeter-totter is always on stable ground to be able to teeter or totter in either direction? And the teetering and tottering we do in our thinking, constantly thinking we're going to find balance, means that when we finally find it, any lack of consistency is going to throw that teeter out of totter very quickly.
Yeah. So are you saying that the most optimistic guy in the world, the guy that's super optimistic, can very quickly become the most pessimistic? He knows that same trait.
Optimism is overcoming pessimism.
Right. So
let me assure you that what's happening right now is happening right now. And what's possible is possible right now. And that is always the case wherever we are, whatever we're thinking. So everything that is happening right now is everything that's happening. Now, what greater possibility could we have than to be in the presence of all that's happening with all that's happening? So we have everything. It's already happening. It means all possibility is possible.
Right.
And what do I choose to worry about? What isn't happening?
Yeah, that's great.
What might happen? What could happen? What should have happened? What I thought would happen? And all of a sudden wonder why I feel doubt in the presence of all possibility. It's an induced state or condition, which tells me that if I start thinking in accurate terms and noticing accurately that the basis of existence does not change when I change my thinking, I can begin to remember that simple component and begin to function on that simple basis, which is realizing truth is true, reality is real, period. No questions, no doubts, no exceptions, and start to remember that that's always the case, which gives me, as Les described, some clarity to begin to see the thinking and the feelings I'm having are a result of what I'm thinking about and how I'm thinking, rather than the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
It's not the thing I'm thinking about that's the problem. It's the thinking I'm using to think about that's the problem.
I was going to ask, that's a great analogy, Jack. I was going to ask Les, how would he describe, I got to ask others, how would you describe your management system? How would you describe it if I was going to ask you what your management system is?
I'm not even sure what we mean by management system, but when you were describing, okay. So we don't like the way that we do or don't do certain things in our life, and we have the ability to manage it. So when you were saying that, Anthony, I was thinking, okay, so I described you as the person that presents themselves as the tears of a clown, always makes fun of what's going on. Me, I think I'm the great deflector. I rely on language and enough of a understanding of others to pretend like I'm in my mind, like I'm being helpful or describing things. And all I've done is deflect you from anything about me that's really happening or how I think about me.
Yeah, I thought I had that in my management.
So I'm the flip side of the same fraudulent, no value coin.
I thought I had that style too. I thought that's what I do. That's what if I was.
Like I say, we're delusional here.
So, Anthony, see, I want you to also notice something.
Yeah.
Part of the mental obsession is constantly trying to figure out how to fix something.
Yeah.
Rather than concede what's broken. And if you're constantly driving a car that breaks down and never really assess the problem, and you keep fixing the wrong thing,
or wanting a new car,
whatever it is, you're just not addressing the problem. And part of the problem here is realizing that when it comes to an absolute nature, there is no management necessary. It's a concession that it's already in perfect order, that it can't be anything other than in perfect order. It can't be any less or more than it is because it's all that is. And that what we are now is very much like Les described thoughts when he started looking at them and seeing them from an observatory point of view, started seeing that they were just thoughts.
Well, how am I going to take credit for that though?
You don't.
What?
That's the whole humans have been fighting to take
credit for something.
Humans have been fighting to take credit for reality, so they have turned ego into God and made believe that if they talk to it longer, more forcefully, more aggressively, or cater to it in some way, the ego will get better when it's a false concept of who we are to begin with. And how much worse could it be than being nothing at all? It isn't. When it's allowed to be what it is, there is no conflict anymore, and we can easily thank whatever that source is for being that source and be grateful for it, because the great fullness of our experience will be obvious, because the fullness of greatness will be obvious.
Well, I can tell you've never lived in a really tough neighborhood before, Jack.
Well, Anthony, you can take credit for this by presenting it as your own to anyone other than the three of us here.
There you go.
There is no neighborhood greater than the one we think we live in our brains when we're obsessively thinking. And there is no greater enemy in the
Okay,
world.
so how do you so maybe this is what you're saying. You started off this whole intro with this great intro about when you're alone, you're in your room or you're by yourself, all your thoughts are your own, so you think you control everything. How do you gently let in other thoughts, or what's the process? So you've got all your own thoughts in this one fish tank. And wait, hold on.
I'd flip that question on you, Anthony. I don't believe that Anthony sits alone with his thoughts. I think he's afraid of his thoughts. And I think that part of the relief for him is communicating with others and laughing about it.
I think you're right, Les. That's a good one. I like that. That register. Say that again.
I believe that your willingness to giggle and challenge either yourself and the axioms that Jack is presenting is the way for you. By doing that, you don't do that when you're sitting with yourself.
No, I don't.
So as a result, you don't like that sitting with yourself. This is your way of breaking out.
That's exactly
and getting not only away from your limited thinking, but also your form of
touching it.
Interactive.
Anthony, it's no different for me. The sick aspect of thinking about this thinking is thinking it's unique to us when it's something we're all doing to any degree that we're doing.
I know for a normal person, they're not supposed to think a lot about it, but for me, I'm a little different. I have that superior brain quality.
It's just, Anthony,
that I'm able to.
If you claim to be abnormal, could you possibly assess normality? Or assess normality.
I don't even know what you're asking me.
Think of that. But again, I want to point out how clearly you think those thoughts are about normal people are and how absolutely assured you are about that, when in fact you're struggling with your own sense of self-doubt. You don't know that other people aren't doing exactly what
I don't know
doing.
what I don't know. That I can accept that. Like, you know how you get these people that don't want to talk. No, I don't know. It's like, okay, would you accept this? That whatever you don't know. Let me
tell you, Anthony.
You don't know.
In an absolute sense, you can't not
know.
know.
See, there's
you can't not know what you know.
Everything. There's that
but
one
you
guy.
you can think you don't know.
I wish Les would mute his phone when he's not even there.
Anthony?
Yeah.
Thank you for thinking it's all about me.
What you know in an absolute sense is what we all know in every sense. In every sense. Always. And
I don't believe that. I think
I know you don't.
Do a whole show.
I know you don't.
You can't know everything, and that you're saying your claim. This claim is too big. It's going to break down.
Let me ask you a question, Anthony. Before you run off in another direction here, let's just stick to what we're talking about. If there's something absolute, it doesn't require your belief to be absolute, does it?
No.
Okay.
That's great. I love that. But what is absolute? Tell me something that's absolute so I know what you're talking about.
You got a dictionary?
Yeah.
I would say absolute means no exception.
What
absolute would, by the way, mean absolute, like truth would mean truth. It wouldn't be something that is exceptional. It wouldn't be something that's unique. It wouldn't be something that isn't shared by all.
Yeah.
Normally, that's a word used for what we call God. The definition that I have in Merriam-Webster says free from imperfection, complete, perfect, absolute liberty, for instance. That would be freedom. Not mixed or adulterated. It's pure.
Not qualified or diminished.
Free from restriction or limitation, not limited in any way. So this feeds into infinite, unlimited, all-knowing, omnipotence, omniscience.
This is weird. There's a philosophy definition here. It says a value or principle which is regarded as universally valid or which may be viewed without relation to other things. Yes. Good and evil are presented as absolutes.
Well, when good and evil are presented in absolutes, they're presented as absolute opposites to each other.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make them absolute because they would be part of the same thing.
Okay, and so you were using in a sentence, which was what again? What were you saying?
Unlimited, infinite,
Yeah.
omnipotent, omniscient. Something that is not exceptional because it can't have
Oh,
exceptions.
to believe in it, whether or not you can believe in it. So if something is absolute, doesn't require us to believe in it, you were saying.
Yes. Yet, if you begin to concede that it's absolute no matter what you think,
Yeah.
now all of a sudden your thinking,
Doesn't matter.
well, your thinking becomes what it is, thoughts. And it
Yeah.
actually is in order rather than disordered as being your primary source. It actually takes its place as it is placed in your brain for thinking for your body and those around you.
An absolute.
So considering things absolute is starting to realize that there is nothing that changes that's absolute when our
So the
thinking
absolute,
changes.
an absolute is food is that I need food to exist. That's an absolute.
Well, we're going way beyond that, Anthony.
But I'm saying that's
We're talking
right back
about
to my same problem, though. It's food. Food is
Well-
absolute.
I feel like good is infinite and bad is finite.
Ooh, that's interesting, Jackie. I like the way out of the blue you just threw that out there. That was pretty good.
the chances are that good would be limited then, and what's absolute would be unlimited. So it probably can't be contained in a word.
It's too finite.
Well,
I
it's the
agree
beginning
with-
of taking reason. The definition of intuition is knowledge beyond reason in a
There we go.
utopian form. Okay. So intuition can also be described as gained experience of things that we know, et cetera. Like mathematics might be considered intuitive. Once we know 2 + 2 is 2, we generally don't have to go through the mechanics that got us to the point where we understand that. We just utilize it naturally.
And just to give you an example of what this meeting is about, this mental obsession, like I was thinking, I wonder if Jackie gives these guys blood pressure tests before she just takes them running, right? Because if they have a problem, they're like, okay, well, why did they just start running down the road with Jackie? But if you took,
They sign a waiver.
but do you do any tests? Like, do
I
you
need
have
to
a
do
blood?
that with Anthony.
But you should take their blood pressure first.
Anthony,
Yeah.
Anthony,
are
enough.
you interested in avoiding the point here or talking about it?
No, I've got it figured out now at this point. We've been talking about this shit for 3 years. It's 2.5 hours.
So if you wanted to be helpful and you want to be connected, you
Yeah.
want to be of service, and you
There
want to
you
spend
go.
your time doing this, why is it you're not trying to participate and help those?
I
There
am.
are-
Yes. Are you really saying that? Are you accusing me of
I'm saying that when you start talking about the blood pressure test that Jackie should be doing, you're just going off on a tangent.
Oh, I was trying to show you about mental obsession because everybody says.
Well, we got that. We had that's the name of the discussion, by the way,
All right.
in case you missed it. It's the first 2 words of the discussion. But I was going to say, Jackie, when you mentioned the good and evil, I was thinking that love is inclusive and hate is exclusive. So it's interesting how some things have an expanding perspective and some things have a limiting perspective.
Well, and to that point, and to yours, Jackie, if you think about things that are expansive, they can expand forever. But if you think about things that are contractive, they can only contract until they make a certain point. And typically, the obsessive thinking is always thinking about trying to make a point, meaning it's contractive. It's not expansive. It's not going beyond the limits of the thinking. It's actually reinforcing the limits of the thinking is all that's there. And that's what defensiveness is, and defiance, and effectively delusion. Because when we begin to believe that the limits of our enforced thinking are enforced by anything other than our thinking, we begin to think that's the extent of our reality and truth. And anything beyond that is a threat and a risk. And it's the exact same thinking that sailors thought when they thought the world was flat because the horizon looked like an edge. So, Anthony, back to the absolute.
Wait, that's what I was going to say. At an hour and 48 minutes, can you edit that last 3 minutes of the broadcast?
So To consider something absolute is to begin to see that it has none of our thinking has any effect on it. And I was getting to the point of intuition being knowledge beyond reason as a utopian ideal. I'm not suggesting there aren't other written forms and ways to think of it. But as a utopian ideal, knowledge beyond reason means that there is no reason in ultimate knowledge that's absolute. It isn't based on a thinking, analytical, reasonable approach. So it isn't logical and it isn't reasonable, and it seems preposterous to logic and reason. So the freedom in beginning to concede, if that's the source, is beginning to experience thoughts for what they are, which is imagined, considerations, ideas. That's it. They aren't reality and they aren't truth. We can use them to express reality and truth, and I suspect that's what their design is to express love as a natural, absolute nature, which would be considerate and generous and giving and productive and beneficial and abundant, which would all align with an absolute nature, because you can't have something more abundant than something that has no limits and doesn't even have a beginning or an end. That's pretty abundant when it comes to thinking about things in thought's version of abundance, because it just goes on and on and on and on and on forever. But even more than that, it isn't going on forever. It's ever present wherever we are now. And that, I would say, has been a bit of a glitch in the concept of forever. If forever never comes, it's kind of a torture chamber, because you're always waiting and you always have forever to wait. You're never quite there. In the ever-present state of presence, we're always there. And so too is everyone and everything, all that is and all that are, including things we don't even imagine exist, are part of this presence if there is any absolute state of existence. It's just natural. So to hash it out in reason is again looking to thought to conclude it's okay, when in fact, if we simply concede it, thought starts thinking in relation of expressing it rather than trying to conclude it so it can take credit for it. And in science, most discoveries aren't discovering anything but things that have always existed. Radio waves, microwaves, all cellular, all that stuff has always existed in the universe. We just concluded how to commercialize it and thought it was a discovery. Because feeling less than, we want more credit rather than being thankful for all that is and simply recognize that we've barely begun to express the abundance we're capable of creating while we've been floundering around in these lesser ideas of who we think we are and imagine someday we'll get them right, when in fact we've created great wrong trying to get there and not conceded it. So that, Anthony, is where the conversation becomes boundless, because there are no bounds in an infinite source. And the irony of all this is that the infinite isn't ironic. The absolute isn't ironic. It isn't paradoxical. It isn't illogical. It isn't unreasonable. It's only illogical and unreasonable to reason that's illogical, that's unreasonable, and logic that's illogical. Yeah. And the presence is starting to see that all of our relative ideas are actually the paradoxes.
Right.
Because the nature of things is the nature of things, and they're in absolute perfect order and always have been and always will be, because they're only translated and having been and will be in forms of time that are all based on what we think, not anything else. There is nothing in the universe wearing a watch or operating on the basis of a calendar. Those are all human creations to help us function, to help us predict. But the one thing we don't seem to be very good at predicting is that if we continue on the wrong course, we're going to end up seeing more wrong in the world. And we keep living with this vain hope and attempt to make believe that somehow it'll get better. if we keep praying for more while we're willing to do the same exact thing over and over and over again. It is no lack of abundance in an absolute source that we suffer from. It is a lack of abundance in our own thinking accurately that is causing the problems that we're starting to face in proportion that are getting, I would say, everyone's attention, because it's changed the weather patterns and all kinds of things. Now, you can think that's not the case, and maybe it isn't. Maybe this is all just some odd confluence of a hateful, spiteful source that's tired of us misbehaving. But I would say an infinite source can't be defensive or reactive or condemning or any of the human terms that we've given these superior creature seeming names, including he, which is often the case for how we refer to God. And wonder why our experience feels depreciated when we're not appreciated enough. And we need more and more and more to keep going and not notice that it isn't more we need, it's the lesser we are thinking that's causing that seeming need. And it's a false need, just like it's false hope to make believe things will get better if we continue to function on a worse basis. It's all folly and frivolity and vanity and arrogance and pride. Beginning to talk about this is beginning to reckon with our own complicity in all of it, if we're actually part of everything. And I would suggest it would be hard if you start noticing, anyone listening, if you start noticing that you always seem to be where you are when you're worried about things that aren't happening, and you always seem to be where you are when you're struggling with anxiety, and you are always where you are regardless of your struggles and whether you like what's happening or not. And liking what's happening doesn't mean it shouldn't be happening. It means we don't like what's happening. And I would suggest that's largely coming out of making believe that we're irresponsible for what's happening because we're not willing to admit the responsibility that our nature provides. Thoughts?
You must be spot on because Anthony's quiet. Well, I think one of the biggest benefits I get from this is recognizing, or at least trying to recognize, the limitation of thoughts. And by recognizing it, that by acknowledging that it's not the be all end all, and that it's not always either the first or the best source, allows me to broaden my perspective, understanding.
I'm losing you a little less.
Allows me to broaden my understanding and maybe even means for how to look at, deal with things, go through life, etc. And I know that I didn't have that perspective. I mean, I've developed, not necessarily even as a result of, addiction or compulsion, but maybe it was part of the growing up process, recognizing how important it is to be able to think, to be able to communicate, to be able to articulate, to be able to understand, to be able to expand. And that reliance or that value placed on thought got apparently an abnormal or obsessive value in the overall context of reality.
Or what we thought was reality. So another little glimmer to look at. Your and I'm going to challenge you, but offer you another way of seeing what you're talking about. You're not finally getting that perspective. You're finally conceding the perspective you've always had. And that is a natural consequence of beginning to see thought for what it is rather than make believe it's who you are. It's natural. And all of a sudden, everything takes its proper proportion. When something is looked at accurately, everything is in proper proportion. It isn't grandiose and it isn't minimized. It isn't maximized. It isn't minimized. Humility is about letting things be as they are. And if things are always as they are, the only time we feel more or less about them is what we're doing and thought about them, not in fact having any impact on them at all. It may make an impression on them somehow because of the weight we bear and create in space, that mental weight of matter that we think matters. And yet, if it's all being induced by what we're thinking, and what we're thinking is wrong to create the pressure that gives us the impression that we are carrying a weight, it's exactly what depression is. So seeing it is starting to recognize that clarity's always been there for all of us. It can't go anywhere unless thinking is in fact more powerful than it. But what happens in our thinking when we introduce thinking to the absolute nature of our existence is it begins to relax and concede things naturally that it would normally be on the defensive against admitting and conceding. It's because we ask it to do what it can't do that turns it into this reactive generator, this nuclear reactive reactor, literally a nuclear reactor fighting against all the family of humankind and unkind. And it's simply a choice we make to have it do that. It isn't a choice we shouldn't have or don't have, because if we're free to do what we want, we're free to do things wrong as long as we want. And to see that is also like starting to see thinking for what it is, because when you begin to see that you're free to continue making things worse, it becomes a lot less interesting to continue, because that same freedom allows you the perspective to start to notice within thinking that it isn't mandatory and it isn't obligatory and it isn't a requirement, and all of the stories that go along with the telling about why it's going to continue all of a sudden start to fall apart, because the only thing that ever held them together was the idea that the only thing we could do was the wrong thing. And it was our only option. And for anyone who ever discovers within an addiction that the simple concession that they're addicted to something is the beginning of having the recovery to begin to see that it isn't their only choice, is the beginning of recovery. It's like the insane person admitting they're insane is sanity. It's the insane person claiming they're sane that continues to manufacture the insanity. And we're not talking about insanity as a medical diagnosis here, but is something that simply is not sane. And sobriety is about sanity. It's about living life according to life's terms, rather than thinking life should abide by our dictates and terms, and wondering why things go so wrong, and why life seems impossible, and the people on the planet are all impossible, and the world is impossible, when in fact we're seeing it through a lens of thought that is impossible because it has no basis other than what we're thinking. So seeing what's wrong accurately doesn't require positive thoughts, but a simple concession that it's wrong. And it's the beginning of being able to unravel and allow the grip that we seem to have on it, which is really a grip on nothing. We have a fist where we're claiming to hold something of value that has nothing in it, but a willingness to fight against what's happening. And that is ultimately the freedom we've always had, and made believe we didn't, to support the contention that all we were doing is all we could be doing because it's all we thought we could do. And beginning to introduce to thinking that thinking is what it is, which is, I would go out on a limb and say, simple imagination, is to allow us to begin to start imagining great possibilities rather than the limited doom that was all we seemed to be able to consider or imagine and thought was truth and reality. because the thinking we were doing had no basis and wasn't even doomed. It couldn't be doomed because it didn't have anything other than the thought it had anything to begin with. It was just simply held by us in the moment as a thought that wasn't true, wasn't real, and really was only an impossibility attempting to be turned into a possibility, which is the same thing as trying to turn a lie into truth, when the whole claim a lie is true is what maintains the lie. And there is no lie without that maintenance of thinking it's true. So we have these conversations on Sunday. This will be uploaded after we're done at some point, depending on how long that takes. We don't have this conversation on the last Sunday of every month, just to celebrate freedom. And anyone out there who's interested in any topics or participating in the weekly conversation, you're more than welcome to join us. I can send you an email link if you send me your email. Phone number would help too, so we can say hello and I can introduce you to some of the basics and just know who you are, understand who you are, think of who you are.
Thank you for the meeting, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for
Les.
coming.
I noticed Les was in a very confident position when he was talking about how he has to remember his mind isn't controlling everything. You had
I'm
your
very
arms
confident
back.
when I talk about you.
What was that, Les?
I said I'm very confident when I talk about Anthony.
Yeah.
Because I'm
look,
deflecting as compared to perspective.
one of the things that's easy to mistake in the whole obsession is to think that all the things we're thinking about everybody else are true and real. And if we had such great clarity in what's wrong with them, how could it be possible that we would be wondering about our own self and doubting our own self? So that clarity comes from, again, trying to excuse ourselves from the doubt and uncertainty that we're actually creating in the imagination that we're perpetuating. So Santiago is just entering. Santiago, we were just closing down.
Hi, Santiago.
But we're happy to see you. How was your tennis match? I think you're still on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun playing tennis today. Thank you. I'm sorry I missed you guys.
It's all right. You were with us. But I was just closing, talking about. Go ahead, Anthony.
This is a good place to recap with Santiago what we talked about. Yeah.
Why don't you give us a little recap, Anthony?
I can't remember. That's the scary part.
No, I listen. Memory. When we're talking about knowledge as an absolute state of knowing, there is no memory in it. And the practice of expressing it is starting to actually be honest about what we're doing with people in ways that we might not normally be honest, and see the fruits and the benefits that come from that honesty. And we use terms like we talked earlier about white lies. We use terms like tough love. Love is never tough. But if you love somebody and are willing to give them what you think about them with the understanding that what you think may not have any basis in anything other than your thinking, it can open a conversation that's very different than the one that we have when we tell somebody what we think as true and real about them and end up creating only a reaction from them that ends up continuing to help encourage the reaction that caused us to think in that way to begin with. And it can be very healing and very opening, because it's really, resentments are never about what's right. Forgiveness is never about what's happening. And we always resent our own involvement in what we're doing to see other people as culpable and not notice what we're doing. And we're never willing to forgive them as long as we are unforgiving the self we're creating the ideas in about who we think they are. Because it isn't true and it isn't real. And to start to be responsible for that in thought is to start to align with the natural responsibility that we have as human beings. Being isn't something that has a body. Being is a present state of mind, a knowing state of mind. Humans have a brain. Thinking and knowing are different to the degree that thinking can think, it doesn't know. And knowing never thinks, so it never thinks it knows. It just simply knows. And to start conceding things on this basis starts to allow thinking to straighten out, because it isn't twisting and turning over the contorted ideas it's trying to prove are true and real, because it simply begins expressing that truth and that reality. And one way to do it between us is speak openly and honestly about our thoughts, claiming them as thoughts, just the sum total of what we're thinking, the sum total of everything that's ever happened to us as a result, causing this thought. And all of a sudden taking the responsibility. Huge shift in a relationship to speak in those terms.
Yeah. And
So
also,
I love you guys. I'm sorry,
well,
Anthony, go ahead.
We had a major breakthrough with Les coming up with exactly the conflict. He was able to identify why there's a conflict with what you're thinking and what's actually happening. Because if you just rely on your thinking, the difference between what's really going on and just your thinking is the conflict, right, Jack? Is that something where you said you put your finger on it? Remember you told Les that?
I don't remember the exact moment, but I understand.
I don't like calling it conflict. I just think that once thinking recognizes the limitations of thinking, it's not a conflict. That gives more credence to thinking than what it really is. I just think it just showed the limitations of thinking. But it's when we recognize that, all we're doing is having a greater, or hopefully an expanded version of reality, truth, universe, higher power, whatever you want to say, and therefore less reliance, less value, less obsession on the one component of that overall reality, which may be thinking.
And Jack, that's great. And Jack started the whole thing with the great intro, Santiago, where he said, what caught my attention is, he goes, if you start limiting your interactions with other people and bringing it smaller and smaller, so only your thoughts are what's controlling. You're just in your own thoughts in a way. You said it better, but you just get a very limited look at everything in a wrong. It's not true, right, Jack? What were you saying about that?
Well, I'll develop that, and the next intro will include that. But the idea that we're isolated is because we're thinking thoughts that are all alone. And as we get further and further alone, we start creating circumstances to support the contention we're alone. And pretty soon we're isolated and sitting alone, thinking only about the thoughts we're thinking about. And it isn't any wonder we feel alone, because it's all we're doing is thinking thoughts. But the aloneness really doesn't come from just thinking alone. It comes from thinking thoughts that have no basis other than what we think they have. And that's ultimately, when something has no substance, it doesn't exist other than in the thinking we're doing. And that's one of the primary issues to begin to notice. One of the things, Les, to your point about conflict, is that conflict in thought is in fact the recognition of our awareness that we're doing something that's conflicted. So if our knowing nature is if our knowing nature is greater than what we think, then we always know better. If we're limiting what we're thinking to what we're thinking, we always know there's more. So why wouldn't we feel less than, and low self-esteem and low self-value, and all those self-worth would be at a low level, because we're recognizing accurately that that little bubble that we're creating certainly is surrounded by a lot more than the limits of my thought.
Yeah, Les gave me some insight, Santiago. You probably already know this, but I didn't know. But that I don't like to really look at myself sometimes. So I joke about myself and others to get my attention off that. But like the reason it's also funny is because I never sit alone and just look at these things. But with you guys, I'm able to kind of prod them and touch them and go, whoa, that hit something.
But Anthony, part of your reactiveness in that way, the laughing and the joking, are all accurate reflections of that thinking you're doing. So it isn't that you don't know, you just use all these dances and parades to make believe that they're all that's happening, because they're all you're promoting and all you're imagining is happening, rather than begin to say, no, let me assure you, nobody thinks what you think is hysterical is that funny. And nobody thinks the parade you're marching to is that interesting, because we're all thinking our own thoughts, and parades seem to be more important than yours.
Or I'm promoting my parade a lot. Like whatever you know about my parade is what I'm promoting, right? It's like, I don't leave it up to like it's like I'm always a promoter, so it's like this is, especially with social media, like, look at my parade. Isn't it a great parade? I don't have to do that. Try not
Well,
to.
the freedom of it, Anthony, also allows for you to do it with a greater sense of benefit than when you think the only benefit is to distract people from what you're actually doing.
Oh shit, Santiago fell asleep, it looks like.
Do you notice how quickly you jump to other people and what's happening around you when
That's called humor, people.
that isn't
Humor.
funny? It really isn't funny. It's as many have said to you in here, it's irritating and it's distracting. And you're welcome to do it, Anthony. I'm not telling you you're wrong, you're bad, you
Yeah.
shouldn't. I'm simply
don't do it.
saying that what you're doing is an attempt to squirm out from actually listening and hearing and wondering why another year or two might go by before you actually start paying attention to some of the basics. And it's,
I already know everything you said. You said I know everything. It's already known. So I don't
Yes.
even have to study for the
Yes.
test. I got it made.
yes, yes.
There's no studying in this class. This is a
Yeah.
class with no
But
study.
that doesn't mean that what you're thinking has been introduced to that knowing in a way that allows your thinking to sit quietly and be present and recognize what's happening as it's happening rather than as you're attempting to have it seem to happen.
Do you like this meeting, Santiago?
That's a very different direction.
Do you like this meeting, Santiago? He's on mute.
So our job here is to interact around these issues and be as honest as we can and begin to recognize our own culpability, our own responsibility for creating how we see things so that as we go about the rest of the 166 or so hours during the week, we can interact in a way that may be more beneficial and helpful to others in a meaningful way, rather than in ways that we just induce ourselves into believing they're just loving because they're at our parade all day long.
Yeah, or it's to laugh at yourself is the answer. Maybe that's the key. Maybe that's why
I don't think, Anthony, you're not laughing at yourself. You're crying over what you're doing and using laughing as an excuse.
I think the best is you guys talk alone because it's a conversation between two people.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about, Santiago?
I don't want to talk about nothing. But every meeting I come is Anthony and Jack.
Sorry, I'll take responsibility for that.
I'm gonna go. I have things to do. Places.
What did you want to talk about? Like, what would you like to talk about?
I gotta go, Anthony.
He told you.
Take care.
All right, love you.
Santiago.
He was upset.
No, I think he was just honest, Anthony.
He wasn't upset.
I would leave that to him, but I would say he was being honest.
It's called body language. I got from the body language he was upset. And his inability to express
Again, you're working on your own clarity about him. And what we're here to talk about is what we're each doing.
So I think the key is to laugh at yourself. Not take yourself too seriously.
I don't think you have a self to take seriously, Anthony. When it's all imagined and delusional, laughing or crying over it gives it credit that it has nothing. There is no credit to a self that's made up in thought. It's all imagined. It's all delusion. There is nothing there. To make believe that you can cry or laugh over it gives it credit. It doesn't have any credit. There is nothing.
2 hours and 17 minutes. It really got really real.
The point of the discussion is to look at things accurately.
Who's left? Everybody left me, Jack. You're the only. If you leave me too, I'm screwed. Turn off the recording, please. You can sign out. Maybe sign out. I chased everybody away, Jack.
No, it's a holiday weekend. There weren't as many people here.
Okay, let's talk seriously though. Can you turn that off for a second?
Well, while we're talking seriously, why don't we leave it on? And I think that might be even more helpful.
Yeah, that ain't gonna happen, buddy. Nobody gets that on there.
It's the whole point of this, Anthony.
I was pretty serious, though.
To evade and avoid is the whole point of what we're doing that makes believe what's happening isn't happening.
I'm gonna have to Google management styles. Self-management styles. Well, how would you describe your self-management style?
Poor.
See, now that's poor me. That's victim, right? Poor.
No, No, I just make believe I manage, and what I tend to manage, I mismanage because
Well, that's a terrible strategy. I think you need to come up with a good management system.
well, I would think from your point of view, that's exactly what you would think.
You don't
And
think
what I am more interested in is beginning to acknowledge a greater sense of knowing than one that needs management.
And
So
that's
I can
true.
begin to allow that knowing self to express itself in ways that know exactly what to do without right and wrong becoming critical
Yeah.
or what I like and don't like. Just simply speak, address, and act in ways that are aligned with a sense of knowing much greater than what I think.
Yeah.
So that isn't something I do well, but it's something I work on. And that's primarily why I do what I do with the people I do it with, and how you've been so helpful in that process.
You've been helpful to me, buddy. Thanks. Yeah, Les, I love Les. He got on me a little bit, but he's listening right now anyway. So if you got to think about it. So he did a great job. I got a lot out of this meeting, which is true. I feel bad. Now, see, I guess it's the codependency. Santiago to me seemed like I'm monopolizing the time. It's always you and Jack. Like he was like, I don't feel wanted. You're monopolized. I feel monopolized. So even though it's helping me a lot, now I'm going to obsess on God. I'm taking up other people's time.
Anthony, both of your parents died in the last 60 days. You've been with them your entire life.
Yeah.
Those are not casual relationships typically.
Right. Those were my managers. Actually, the reason maybe I'm questioning this is because I had two of the greatest or two pretty good managers.
Well, think of what happened to your mom when your dad died. All of her management style evaporated immediately and she had a major stroke.
Yeah.
And then ended up helpless in a bed.
Yeah, we talked about that. That was her.
And the two of them were obviously almost 70 years married, were obviously very, very close.
2 days
had connections to each other.
She had that stroke.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why maybe I'm open to a new manager.
Well, you have a new manager and it's called an absolute source. Whatever it is defined as is irrelevant. Whatever name we use is irrelevant. Whatever
is that what this meeting is about? Mental obsession or an absolute source?
Well, it's about what happens when we make believe thinking is that absolute source. And that's what we're here to talk about. When we think thinking is the only source, we believe who we are is what we think, and who is in charge is ego.
Yes, it's all about the absolute source is what you're saying.
Well, it doesn't even have to be about it if it is. We don't have to talk about it for it to be as it is. But as we start talking honestly about our thinking, our awareness of that becomes much clearer. As Les pointed out, it isn't because his thinking made the perspective clear. It's because his thinking allowed him to see the clear perspective he's always had. And the clear knowing that he's always had. It isn't something that happens for the first time. It's something that we finally begin to admit all we've been doing is clouding and refusing to accept and
I just thought of another kind of interesting aspect of myself. It's interesting, but when people talk about is the glass half empty or half full, we're also talking about which angle are you looking at it from. If you look at it from right above the parade, it looks pretty full, right?
What does it matter?
So what angle where you're at in the parade, what you talked about, if you're right in the parade,
you're only conceding, Anthony, that viewpoints are deceptive and positions are deceptive.
Right.
And positions give impressions that aren't accurate.
That's my statement. That's my claim.
Okay. So you're trying to find a new mismanagement style for perspective to finally clarify truth and reality.
Yeah. In a nutshell. Yeah.
So it'll never happen. It'll never happen.
That's the name of our book.
The whole point of the first step, admitting powerlessness over alcohol, is seeing that it's unmanageable because it's unmanageable, not because we'll someday begin.
How about if we write the book, I'll Never Stop? You know how they always try to get you to stop drinking and stuff? Like an alcoholic would like something that's just straight to the point, like I'll never stop drinking. I'll never stop. They would want to read that, right? They're like, okay, if they got to the program and you're like, okay, you have to read this book about I'm never going to stop drinking. You're like, okay, right? Wouldn't that be kind of an interesting book for them to read? Because it nails it on the head. It doesn't try to go around it. No?
I'm not going to follow you into these thoughtless endeavors.
Sounds like you're done too. You did a great job today.
They're just launches, Anthony. You're doing everything you can to distract
when I write
yourself from
that
a conversation.
Book that I'm gonna.
I could leave you in here alone and you'd continue. Listen, I love you. I give your best to my family and your nephew who's getting married today.
Yeah.
And, your sister and brother. And
yeah, and I'm sorry for monopolizing the time again. Everybody that listens to this goes, God,
you need not be sorry for anything you do. Just look at it and wonder if maybe it could give you information that would be worth listening to, rather than making believe jumping to the next thought and idea is your salvation. Just look at it. Yeah. You've done a good job. You've come a long way. I appreciate you. You've been a great participant in this process.
I couldn't have done it without you, buddy.
Well, you could have, but you didn't.
It was a lot easier. I walked through everything. I tap danced through everything. But I like You Can't Make Me. Something like that. Something so rebellious that an alcoholic would love. You can't stop me. Like, here, read this. It's called You Can't Stop